Good Tuesday evening to you, aviation enthusiasts. I'm starting to really like that song. I got to tell you, that thing's just in my head now. I'm Jamie Beckett, Florida ambassador for the AOPA Foundation. Down there on the bottom is Pat Brown, at least on my screen, coming all the way from Texas. Over there on the top right is Kay Sunrum from California. She's been dealing with some issues today, and that's why we're going to be talking about weather. As always, you can talk about whatever you want. You can ask us any question you want, as long as it's not excessively personal. Let's have some boundaries there, but we'd be happy to chat with you. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it snows, sometimes the freezing level goes to the ground, and we're pilots. So we have to actually think about the weather. How do we gather it? How do we make decisions about it? How do we get away from it? Where's the cocoa dispenser? Kay, you've had a heck of a day with Southern California weather, and I thought by law it's supposed to be beautiful in Southern California, but apparently there was a transgression today.
Yeah, usually it is. Here in San Diego, it's typically 70 plus or minus a few degrees, but we do get a lot of weather where we also need an instrument rating or we need to stay at home. And today was one of the days that was not good to fly. A lot of rain, lots of wind. Santa Ana winds is pretty common here at certain times of the year. Right now, January, February, sometimes we get it in the springtime too. But we had gusty winds up to 30, 40 knots. You don't want to be flying around during that time. And so I decided to
that's one of the things. That's one of the things I wanted to talk about when we were planning this session is wind. A lot of times we don't really think of wind as weather. We think of precipitation and cloud cover and all that sort of thing. But wind is a big deal. And Pat Brown, being a DPE, I joke about this, but I actually have seen people show up for their check ride. They get through the oral just beautifully. And of course, they're still nervous. And the wind is 18, gusting to 28, and they're flying a Cessna 162. And the examiner says, "What do you think?" And the applicant says, "Well, I guess we should go." And that's kind of the end of it. So wind in and of itself is really worthy of our attention, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I had made a trip up to Dallas for a Rusty Pilot seminar about maybe a month ago or so. And it was one of those days like Kay's describing. Fortunately, the wind was pretty much right down the runway and it wasn't too gusty. So I went ahead and I was in a heavy airplane. So I went ahead and went. I had 40 knots on the nose the entire trip to Dallas. It was painful, better than driving, but it was painful. Now you would think coming home the next day, I would have a tailwind. Oh, no. At best, it was off the left wing. So that didn't help. But there's justice in the world, because this past Saturday, I flew up to Tyler to do a Rusty Pilot seminar, similar day. But this is after we had a cold front that was going to be coming through Friday night. I had 38 knots off the tail going up to Tyler in my 182. It took me 47 minutes to get there. It's a 158 nautical mile trip. Coming home, I just knew we were going to have a headwind. Nope, actually had about 6 knots on the tail. So that's a good thing.
It really is. And we got Mike B coming in from Maryland tonight, which I like. That's a big distance. And Eric Pittman says, "Hey, aviators, we got a big tip of the hat to Eric Pittman. He works at Publix, a supermarket. He lived through the Thanksgiving experience. I really got to hand it to folks who do Thanksgiving at supermarkets. That's rough. But yeah, you're right, Pat. I fly a 152, the most exotic, spectacular airplane in the general aviation fleet. I've been flying them for years, as you guys have. I've had as high as 128 knot ground speed in a 152 on a long cross country, and as low as 48. So wind can make a huge difference. Just, do we get there, or do we have to stop 3 times for fuel? I mean, Donnie, I think we've got a graphic, if you do, about wind indicators. There's the wind T, there's a tetrahedron, and there's a wind sock. And Kay, these kind of matter because they all define the direction of the wind in a different manner. I mean, the tetrahedron, they used to have one at my home field, and the challenge I always had with it with students is it points to where the wind was coming from last, but that might have been 3 days ago.
Somebody has to go out and move it, right?
They're not supposed to.
But yeah, I mean, the tetrahedron, it's a classic on the written test. The tetrahedron shows points into the wind sock points away from the wind. So knowing how these work and what the limitations is kind of matter. Have you ever early in your career been a little flummoxed by which method are we using, and or had that issue with students where they just weren't getting that the wind T is not the same as the wind sock?
You know what? Most of the time, I've always seen the windsock. I don't even think I've seen the other two except on written exams or when teaching somebody.
The tetrahedron is actually pretty rare. You don't see it much anymore.
Right.
I always look at the windsock, and the way I remember it is you always take off out of the big end of the windsock. So that's kind of
Fly in the little end, out the big end.
Yeah.
I like that. Well, Pat, we were talking earlier, and there actually has been a significant amount of change to how we get a weather briefing, how we gather that information. And the FAA has just recently put out an advisory circular on that very point, haven't they?
Yeah, I think it was in March. It's Advisory Circular 91-92. And because we can't, well, we've always been able to do self-briefing if we could find the right information. But this is the first time that at least that I'm aware of, that it's been put into writing in a form that you can actually download. It's a few pages long, and it's actually a pretty good advisory circular, and it tells you the elements of a good weather briefing, so that you can make sure, if you are talking to a briefer, that you're getting all the things, and if you're doing it yourself, that you're again looking at the appropriate things and making the appropriate notes. Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, now the way I've gathered information, Kay, over the years has changed dramatically. Of course, I'm still a Luddite and call 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF if I'm leaving the pattern, if I'm going any distance. But there's all kinds of online options for us, aren't there?
Yes, there is. You know, I still use 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF. The telephone number, I hope they never change that. But the website is great, and you can log in there with your profile, put in your aircraft profile, personal information. You just have to do that once, and then it stores your information. This is through Leidos, the government contractor, and just about everything that you need is on that website. Now, I know a lot of people use the electronic flight bags, and I do too. But keep in mind that the information, the weather information, is most likely coming from National Weather Service, NWS. It's not the aviation app that's actually producing all that weather information. It's the way that they're presenting is going to be different from one app to another. But I like to start with that big picture at 1-800-WeatherBrief.com, and then dive into the more details. But start with the big picture first.
I like that. I like that a lot. By the way, Eric Pittman is back with a comment, says he's never seen anything other than a windsock. And I think that's increasingly true. The tetrahedron and the wind T are older things. It's just because of my extraordinarily advanced age. I've seen some tetrahedrons. And Aaron Ratz says there is a tetrahedron at Kilo Romeo Uniform Echo. I'm not sure where that is. And he thinks he's seen a T once, but he doesn't remember which aerodrome. I think probably you'll see a lot fewer, and maybe only because it's relatively cheap to put up a windsock, and you can have several of them around the airport. And that was I think my last wind-related thing. Donnie, do we have an image of wind coming across the runway over buildings and such like that? One of the things we have to consider is if you go to airports where there are multiple windsocks around end of the runway, center of the runway, over by the FBO, sometimes they're pointing in different directions. And I used to fly at an airport, pardon me, I used to fly at an airport where there was a tall tree line parallel to the runway. So the wind, when it was out of the west, would just spill over it, and you'd get this rotor. You just had to have that local knowledge of realizing your approach was going to be nice and stable, but it was going to be weird. Pat, have you ever dealt with that in the great state of Texas, where everything is bigger, I assume the wind included?
Yeah, at my home airport, if we have a north wind, it's affected. Well, the trees that are on the south end of the runway really affect that and essentially deflect the wind up. So with the north wind, we just pretty much know landing to the north you need to just relocate your touchdown point about another 1,000 feet down the runway. There's another airport not too far from us that has a east-west runway, and of course the winds are generally more or less southeast from the southeast. And when those hit the hangars that line the runway on the south end of this north-south, this east-west runway, again, they kind of create a rotor effect. So once again, if you're landing to the east at this particular airport, you better just shoot about another 1,000 feet downfield, or else you're going to get beat up. Yeah, it's absolutely right.
Yeah, and Eric is making the point at his home airport, two windsocks are fairly close together, but they're often looking in different directions. And Aaron's back, KRUE is Russellville, Arkansas. I've never flown into Arkansas. Now I have a reason to. That'll be worthwhile. Hey, Kay, we're talking about weather, and of course we encourage people to ask questions about whatever they want, but from a really high level perspective, why is weather even important? I mean, isn't it more about the John Wayne thing about handling the airplane and the bravery and all that kind of stuff? I mean, why do we care about weather at all?
Well, the weather can really impact the way you fly, right? It's not just the wind, but you want to make sure if you're a VFR pilot, you better be in VFR conditions. If it's marginal, all right, some people like that. I personally like VFR and IFR, and I don't like the stuff in between. If it is marginal VFR and closer towards IFR, I prefer to file IFR. And so there's a lot of components. It's not just the wind, it's not just the visibility, but it's also knowing what your personal minimums are. And if the weather conditions don't meet that, then you have to make some good choices on the ground. I think we're going to be talking about personal minimums later on, but that's part of the pre-flight planning, knowing what you're capable of doing. And that comes with skill, and it comes with proficiency. You might be a really experienced pilot, but the weather can still get you. And statistics show that it's not the newbies that get into weather-related accidents. It's actually the more experienced pilots, because we become complacent and we think that we are capable of going through any type of weather, and we're not. So again, think about the not just the wind, but the turbulence, the visual conditions, and what you're capable of and what your airplane is capable of.
Yeah, absolutely true. Absolutely true. And of course, regionally, weather changes. I must interrupt to say, Harry Feingerish says, hi there, aviators. So hi right back at you, Harry, for all of us. And I think this is a Cyrillic name. I think that's a Russian name. I'm not sure. I can't tell off the thing. So in case it is a Russian viewer, здравствуйте, как ты поживаешь? Thanks for coming. I don't know much, but I'm clinging to it for all I'm worth. Pat, I was just saying, weather is very regional. I mean, it happens everywhere. But for instance, I woke up today with 200 overcast. It's what happens this time of year in Florida, and it'll eventually burn off. But we did get rain today. Now, that's not a serious issue for me because I don't have the freezing layer for me is way up high. Right. But if I was in the mid-Atlantic states or in the Midwest, that presents a whole different thing. And even where you are, you get up into North Texas, freezing is an issue, and that liquid rain could be super cooled liquid rain, couldn't it?
Oh, yeah. And, anytime you've got visible moisture, when you have those kind of temperatures, I mean, that's just kind of almost aviation 101. I was flying home from Dallas a couple of years ago before COVID. I had done something up there, and I was late leaving. And I don't typically like to fly IMC at night. But in this particular case, the ceilings were high enough that I could very safely fly underneath the overcast. But ATC put me up on top, and I went. And I have to tell you, I'm making a confession here as a very experienced pilot. It just didn't occur to me to turn on the pitot heat. I can't believe I made that boneheaded mistake. But got up on top, everything was fine. And 40 miles later, it was clear visibility unlimited. But, I don't care how experienced you are, you can make a stupid mistake. And I certainly did.
Yeah, in my entire career, I've never turned on the pitot heat one time. But I'm in the subtropics, so it's just not necessary. But I'll bet you Andy from Maine has done it. Hey,
Oh, yeah.
Andy from Maine. And that's one of those things, when I did fly up in the Northeast, and we'd get those scuddy days where it's maybe 1,200, 1,500 feet, and you're flying in the pattern with students because you just can't get any place else because of the cloud clearance and the mountain clearance or hill clearance. But you can end up with light rime icing, even though you're in clear air, just because this mist is coming down. I've not had that issue here. That's a big part of why I live here.
Jamie, one other thing I would point out, people think, oh, Southern California. Well, she's probably never used pitot heat in her life before, but it's not true because I got a lot of terrain and I got to get up higher altitudes. And so you need to be wary of what the temperature is at the altitude that you're flying, not just the region. Yes, Southern California is very warm, but we also have very, very large mountains, and we got to sometimes get up to 12.5 where it is obviously colder. So got to keep in mind your surrounding terrain, not just where you're taking off from.
Well, and that kind of leads into the next thing I was going to talk about. I said I woke up this morning, it was 200 overcast. Okay, I'm not scheduled to fly. Tomorrow I am, and we're expecting something very similar. I find that by looking at the METAR for my local airport, the meteorological report for the terminal area, and it's telling me what the weather actually is within this 4 or 5 mile area. Now, I also want to take a look at my destination, the METAR there, and I want to look at what's in between. And this is a great graphic. I got to give total credit to the magnificent Pat Brown. Pat, why don't you talk to us about why you use it like this? Because this is just a whole collection of METARs, but it gives you a great picture.
Well, Kay was talking earlier about 1-800-WX-BRIEF. Add a .com to that, and it's the Leidos Flight Service website. And if you take a look at this fictional trip from Houston out to El Paso, if you go to that website and you put in all the details on the trip and you hit submit, you're going to get a split screen back like this. And if you take a look at that little red box there, it encircles all of the METARs. And at a glance, literally at a glance, because they all line up, because the formats are all the same, they all line up, and at a glance you can tell what the current conditions are currently along your route. Now, it's no guarantee they're going to stay that way. If you click on the TAF choice there, and Donnie, can you throw that one up? That'll look similar to this one. But you'll see that if you click on TAF, all of the sky conditions typically tend to line up as well. So not only do you have a good look at the METARs telling you what is, and in this case looking good, but you've got all these TAFs that are telling you what they think it will be, that at least right now look like it would be a pretty good chance of being able to make this trip without any kind of issues. And Jamie, if I could just keep the floor for just another second or two and ask Donnie to throw up that other slide. And when the question is why plain language, or why coded weather versus plain language, there's plain language right there. And it's much, much easier if you get reasonably good at reading coded weather to be able to make those determinations much, much, much quicker. Than having to read each line in this hodgepodge of just crap.
Well, you're not kidding, especially for a long trip, because if you were to print out all the METARs and TAFs, you got a book where it's just a page for the others. I got to say hey to Jennifer Johnson, who, wow, I've never seen this, very awesome. I think she's talking about you, Kay, because nobody calls me awesome. And by the way, I'm going off topic here. Are you braced? You ready? We're just going to take a little bit of a shift. The next scheduled Ask an Ambassador would be on Tuesday, December 28th, between Christmas and New Year's. So we're going to throw it out to you, the viewer. Should we hold an Ask an Ambassador on the 28th, or should we just prep for a massive week-long party? Please leave us something in the comments, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook. Put in the comments just yes or no, or I don't care. Put something in there, because we really do try to do this so that it's most beneficial to you. Our discomfort and personal inconvenience means nothing, Can I get an okay on that?
Amen.
Also, please share the link to this program just so other people are aware of it, because Jennifer Johnson learned something she didn't know. Eric Pittman learned something he didn't know. Let's spread it out there. I might learn something I didn't know. It's entirely possible. So we're just talking about METARs, and I'll tell you, Pat, I do exactly the same thing you do on a long trip. And we actually briefed for one when I was flying from Houston back to Florida. We did a very similar thing. One of the things I key on is temperature and dew point, which I think a lot of people skip over. But by looking at temperature and dew point, I'm giving myself a hint at what the TAF is going to tell me, the forecast, because it's giving me a sense along that line as I move westward or eastward or whatever direction. I'm probably, if I'm going hundreds of miles, I'm probably moving into another weather system. And it gives me some idea. Am I going to encounter lower clouds as they come together or fog? But that leads us into the TAF, okay, the terminal area forecast. How do you use that to your benefit when you plan flights?
You know, I do take a look at it. I like the 24 hours as opposed to longer versions, because I think 24-hour forecast is itself pretty, far out there. And I don't rely too much on it because it's not always accurate, right? Is weather always accurate? Of course not. So
I think that you're saying not always. It's extraordinarily generous, but
So, and even with the METARs, I know both of you said that you like to use a lot of the METARs, and I do, depending on the terrain that I'm going to cross. And the same applies to the TAF, because it could be all green for the METARs and for the TAF. However, a lot of times I'm not able to get there because I got a crossover terrain that simply is not 3,500 feet. It's a lot higher than that. And let me give you an example of a trip that I just had very recently. I was coming from Scottsdale, Arizona. It was severe clear. It said everything in San Diego was severe clear, but there is a huge overcast at 5,000 feet, and I can't get into San Diego from the mountains in any other way than filing an IFR flight plan. Even though I'm severe clear weather leaving Arizona, pretty much my entire en route is VFR, and the airports are all showing green. So it can be very misleading if you just see an entire map of green, but you don't take into account the terrain along the way. And so there was absolutely no airport within San Diego County that I could have gone into without coming in IFR. And so that's something to keep in mind. And the same applies to the TAFs.
Got to point out, we have one of our great viewers. I'm so flattered. Mike Jesh is watching. Kay, I think you know Mike Jesh. I met him in San Luis Obispo, I think 8 years ago, and no restraining order yet. So I guess we're still on solid ground. But we also have another Mike B, asking a very good question. What about icing? What's the best way to be prepared and have a good grasp on what's going on with icing? And Pat, I'll come to you on this, because at one point when we had the PTS, before the Airman Certification Standard, when it was still the practical test standard, that was actually an area of special emphasis, icing, because icing is so incredibly dangerous. And very often people don't take it seriously, or at least don't understand it to the level that they can continuously conduct flights safely. What do you have to share for us about icing and preparing for a flight where icing might be a factor?
Stay out of it.
Thank you. Coming on back.
Back to you, Jamie. No, he's asking what's the best reference to get a good grasp on icing. I think the National Weather Service, aviationweather.gov, is good. There's an icing app there that you can click on. ForeFlight has the same thing. When you look at some of the options there on the weather page, there's one that you can overlay icing on the map, if I'm not mistaken. I don't use that much down here because, again, if there's any kind of icing even possibility, I just stay on the ground. None of the airplanes I fly have icing capabilities other than pitot heat, and that's not good enough. So But ForeFlight and aviationweather.gov would be the two probably best ones that you could look at. I'm sure Garmin Pilot and some of the others have it as well.
Yeah, I'm really careful about icing like you. I don't have anything, and I have no anti-ice. I have no de-ice. If there's known icing, I just stay out of it. I actually have been flying in the pattern at an airport up north when I was a CFI up there years ago, where I was picking up light rime icing, and I terminated the flight. And I was actually surprised because other people kept flying, and they're like, "Well, it's just a little bit of rime ice." And it's like, I'm just more conservative than that. It can happen quickly. And I will say this, I'm a big believer that frost is evil. And I've had many, many conversations with people who don't really seem to understand. It's not about the weight of the ice that the frost represents. It's what it does to the airflow. And unfortunately, Kay, maybe you've seen this happen out your way. I've certainly seen it on the East Coast. People do something they shouldn't have done and they get away with it. And they're like, well, that's okay. I guess you can fly with frost on your wings, and you might get away with it a few times. But eventually you're not going to. And that's what's really tragic. What kind of issue, you're down at the coast, sea level, relatively warm, but you've got the mountains just a little ways to the east. What kind of concerns do people in your neighborhood have to have about ice or icing conditions?
Well, you've mentioned a few things about icing. It's not the weight, but people really need to understand that even the slightest amount, it changes the aerodynamic properties, right, of the lifting surfaces, of the non-lifting surfaces. And you really have to take a good look and see if that can form before you take off, if it's on there. And then once you plan your trip, think about anywhere that you're going to get in contact with moisture. And if that happens and the temperature is conducive to icing, then you don't go unless you have FIKI, a flight into known icing, and you have the equipment for that. You got to keep in mind other things around here, around the coast. You're asking for in California. We have the marine layer. Now, this is not icing. I'm going to go off a little bit, but this is a big one out here, and it's more of a, I think, a California thing. But first, let me say so what is a marine layer? Well, it's officially it's an air mass, right? And it's you can think of it as kind of a bubble that's trapped, and that special weather phenomenon that happens above large bodies of water. And sometimes people want to avoid that marine layer, and so they'll climb higher and higher, and they'll get into icing because they're simply trying to stay VFR, and you can't see icing, but you can see the marine layer. And so it's a combination of those two, and you get the marine layer that goes right up to the mountains. And then people think, all right, I have to be above it, so I'm going to climb above, and then they get into icing. So they're avoiding one danger and they're getting into another danger. Harry
Feinger's great comment. It's simple. Icing conditions, don't fly. How easy is that? And for general aviation pilots, you're right. It's not a military mission. We don't have to go. And Pat, I'll come back to you with we could just focus on the freezing layer. But that's not the whole story, is it? Because we can have supercooled liquid water coming from above the freezing layer to below. And when it impacts the airframe, it turns to ice. So we really do have to have an understanding of icing, don't we?
Yeah, and that's where ForeFlight comes into play, and where the National Weather Service, aviationweather.gov, comes into play, because you can click on those various products and get at least an idea of where they say the icing layers are forecast to be. Of course, as we've talked about before, the weather forecasts are just that. They're educated guesses, but they're just guesses. Pretty good ones usually, but it's just a guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't overlook pilot reports. Very often people don't think of looking those up, but pilot reports, certainly Mike Jesch knows this from the airlines, the people in front of you will tell you what the ride's like, but you can go look at pilot reports from your area and find out, are people reporting icing? I'm seeing conditions that I think might be conducive to it. Now, I live in Florida, Central Florida. I believe we have established it is the greatest place on the planet. Can we all agree to that? I don't really have the problem with icing very often. If I went high enough, I might, because we do have a lot of moisture in the air, but we have thunderstorms. And believe it or not, early in my career, I was a relatively stupid pilot. I think that would be the appropriate term, just dumb as dirt. And I didn't understand thunderstorms. And I will tell you, I knew enough to stay out of them and to not fly under them. But I remember a cross-country flight I was making once. I was building time towards my commercial certificate, and there were 2 thunderstorms, maybe 10, 15 miles apart. And it's a long way around. So I split the difference between them. This was a horrible idea. This was a really, really horrible idea. It seemed fine until I got right between them, and it was extraordinarily turbulent and really scary. So I don't do that anymore. But I don't know, Kay, do you even get thunderstorms in California? I know Pat does in Texas, and it is one of those things, even a small thunderstorm is not to be taken lightly.
Right. No, we do. We do not like the way that you guys do, but when we have thunderstorms, we're not flying. And yes, they say 20 miles, but there's lots of microclimates around here. And so I just stay put.
I got it. By the way, Mike Jesh has a really great comment here, and he flies big iron, but he says he likes the freezing level to be at least 5,000 to 6,000 feet above the MEA, the minimum en route altitude, if there's visible moisture on his route. Now, I suspect he's talking about GA flying, not big iron flying, but Mike's a smart guy. He knows what he's talking about, and that's a great thing. You talked about personal minimums before, Kay. Having a standard that we look to and say, I'm okay with this because I have the equipment, Pat. Maybe I've got de-ice or anti-ice and I'm current with IFR and all that. But maybe I don't, and maybe I'm not. So having those personal minimums can be a big thing. It's not just for cloud clearance and visibility. It's also for things like icing.
Yeah, Kay mentioned microclimates and things like that. And I remember this is a long time ago. I was a flight instructor, fairly new flight instructor, and I was with a student. It was beautiful VFR conditions where we were flying back to Houston, and we were flying east back towards Houston. There were reports of major thunderstorms, I don't know, probably 50 miles east of Houston. So we're west of Houston, flying east into Houston, so we're kind of flying that way. And he got the weather forecast, and I was watching him write things down, and he wrote down outflow boundary. And I will admit to being ignorant as to what an outflow boundary was, so we just went ahead and took off. We got about halfway back to Houston, and I saw some dust in a field down below us. And about 2 seconds later, we got hit by something that turned the airplane nearly inverted. And we got the airplane righted. I mean, stuff was just flying out, just flying around the cockpit. We got the airplane righted and turned away from it. And, as if it wasn't dumb enough to keep going, we turned back that same direction and flew right back into it. Same thing happened again. That was enough to get our attention. And we turned around, went the other way, and landed and waited. Did not really realize what happened. It wasn't until I started to do some research that I realized that outflow boundary was a gust front from basically the dissipating stage of those thunderstorms, which, conservatively speaking, were probably 80 miles away from us. So that old adage about staying 20 miles away from thunderstorms or whatever, don't bet your life on that. I can tell you from personal experience that's not necessarily anywhere close to being enough. And I learned a big lesson.
Yeah, thunderstorms come in different sizes, and some of them can be 50, 60,000 feet high, and those are powerful things. Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit. Not that we haven't been talking about some fascinating stuff. Oh, I know what I did want to add to that, though. we have a tendency as pilots to be taught meteorology, weather, not by meteorologists, but by other pilots who may have a relatively superficial knowledge, especially if they're young flight instructors who are just getting started in their career. There's an enormous amount of information about there. Even the FAA has some books about weather that you can download free as a PDF, and I would strongly recommend you do. But between YouTube videos and educational programs like this and talking to really smart guys like Mike Jesh, you can learn a lot about weather and about your area, because as we see here, Pat and I in Texas and Florida have some weather concerns that maybe they don't have up there with Andy in Maine, and vice versa. So, hey guys, let's get into the graphical area forecast tool, because that's something that didn't even exist when we all started flying. And it's become kind of a go-to thing for me. Kay, are you a big fan of the graphical area forecast tool, or are you kind of going in a different direction?
Oh, I love the graphical area forecast tool, or GFA, we call it for short. It replaces the old area forecast where, remember, we used to have to plot things out from this airport, this radial, this distance, and figure out what geographical area they're talking about. Now, you get a picture, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. Mm-hmm. And what's nice about it is that you can also click on which layers you want to see. Is it the freezing levels, or is it just VFR or IFR conditions? You can click on any of those items. Plus, you can zoom in. There's a little slider bar, and you can figure out what the larger picture, we talked about that earlier, what is that doing with time? Perhaps you're not going to be landing there for a few hours, and so take a look at the TAF as opposed to the METAR. So there's a GFA for the METAR and for the TAF. And you can just kind of play around with it and see where your route is and what you can do to avoid any weather. So I love that tool.
Yeah, it's a huge advance over the old area forecast. And I got to say hey to Hunter Timko, who just came in. Hunter Timko, for those of you who don't know, is awesome. She's absolutely amazing. I met her at a special event down in Naples, Florida last month, and I believe we shared a donut together. And that's the key to friendship with me. If you bring a box of donuts, we're in good shape. Harry Feininger just brought up TAF versus MOS, M-O-S. And Pat, we were just talking about this before the program. First of all, what's the difference between the terminal area forecast and the MOS, which, wait a minute, I know it, model outlook statistics.
Model output statistics is what that stands for. It's typically a 3-day forecast, if you will. And by the way, Harry, I'm out of West Houston Airport, 12 miles north of where you are, to answer your earlier question. The MOS is the way I explain it when we're talking about rusty pilots is this: if you ever pay attention to the weather forecast when we have a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, and you see all those spaghetti model lines that are saying, well, it could go here, it could go there, it could go anywhere. Those come from various weather forecasting outfits around the world. And one might be the European model, for example. And so what happens is they take all of these models and they kind of just stir them all together in this big old witch's cauldron and average them all out. They use something called regression analysis. It's a statistical method of kind of throwing out the high and the low score, kind of like, the Russians in the Olympics or something. I don't know. But and then they just kind of throw it out on the table and say, okay, well, we think this is what's going to be happening. So it's a way kind of of statistically balancing out all of these various forecasts that go, by the way, down to the MOS actually goes down to 3 meters off the ground. And it's good typically for 3 days. Interestingly enough, as I was looking for a graphic to put up on the MOS, I found a notice that the MOS is going to be phased out over the next couple of years in favor of something called the National Blend of Models. And that's Donnie just put that up on the screen. You can just Google that, I guess, and find it. I found it through a bunch of different links, but It's basically a blend of both the National Weather Service and non-National Weather Service numerical weather prediction model data and post-processed model guidance. That's what the actual definition of that is. So what does that mean? Is that it looks like it may be an attempt to be a little bit more perhaps accurate than the MOS. I don't know. But I don't know what format it's going to take. But this is just something that I just learned today in preparing for this. So nobody knows everything. That's why it's important, as we talked about during the pre-show, that we stay up on top of this stuff, right?
Yeah, I actually I'm a big fan of the MOS. I like it for long-term planning. If I've got especially a long flight coming up a few days from now, I kind of keep an eye on the MOS so I have an idea of, do I want to shift the timing of my departure based on that? And this is what it looks like on ForeFlight for me, and I'm a big ForeFlight user. But I can have my route on there, and it'll give me all kinds of information. It's kind of presented like a METAR or a TAF, but as Pat says, it'll give me that 3-day outlook, and it's really helpful. I'm thinking, by the way, guys, I think Harry Feingers has my notes because he says flight service, which is the next topic on our run order, and I'm going to out myself. I have a couple times found myself in a situation in a fairly minimally instrumented airplane in VFR conditions that don't stay very VFR. And flight service, specifically St. Pete Radio, has been a huge benefit to me when this happens, because I like to say, as long as you've got a radio, you're not alone in the airplane. Kay, you've got a different thing. I live on a sandbar. I think the highest obstacle in Florida is 12 feet, and it's a ladder down at Home Depot. But you have mountains. Now, I can get flight service on 122.2 pretty much from 1,500 feet anywhere in Florida, except maybe the Big Bend. You have a different issue, but flight service really can be a huge help if you found yourself on top of a layer that closed up and you're trying to find a hole to get through or whatever. How do y'all use it out west?
Oh, absolutely. There's what's called RCO, remote communication outlet. So we have a few of those, and it's nice to keep in mind what those frequencies are in the areas that you fly. The 122.2, the universal frequency you mentioned, always works, but you do need to let them know exactly where you are. But if you go with an RCO, then they're basically a flight service station that is located at that spot.
Yeah, we have a few of those, but because, as I say, because Florida is so flat, you can use the RCO on the ground, but you really don't need it in the air. By the way, to the attendees here, hang out, because in just a moment we're going to get to Stump the Ambassador, where we take one of your questions. It's actually a little challenging, and we see if one of the ambassadors can deal with it. And if we can't, we'll send you a hat. And if we can, I don't know, do we go over their house and take something of equal value? I'm not sure how we do that.
Potato salad. We take potato salad, Jamie.
It's not a bad idea, because it's getting late. I'm kind of hungry.
Hey, Jamie, before you go on, just a real quick note about the MOS. One of the questions we had was, why choose the MOS over the TAF? And the answer is you don't. The TAF is the one. I mean, that's the one that if you're going to look at, that's what you're going to look at. The MOS is supplementary. It's nice to have, but I would never put my life on the line based on a MOS any more than I would with the TAF. But the TAF is the one. Yeah,
and Erdem Burl comes up with an interesting point. He says FlyQ is also good. We're talking about the electronic flight bags. Absolutely. I mean, I happen to use ForeFlight. I've just used it for a number of years, and that's what I adapted to. There's a bunch out there that you can use that similar information, just presented differently. For instance, I'm an Apple guy. Pat, for no known reason, is an Android guy. It's okay. We still get along, and however you gather information, that's good. The key is, as Pat was just saying, take the time and gather the information. Don't try and take a shortcut and just do this. Because if all you're using is the MOS, if all you're using is the TAF, if all you're using is the METAR, you're just getting a little slice of the picture, and you need a bigger one. Kay, let's talk about personal minimums. You brought it up earlier, and it's one of the most important topics in weather, I think. Mike Jesch gave us a great example of his, or at least part of his. What's your position on personal minimums? Let's say you're flying with a primary student who's just about to take their check ride. What do you tell them about personal minimums?
Oh, I introduced the personal minimums very early on, well before the check ride. And the reason is I want students and experienced pilots to really know what their minimums are and not have to think about it. Because if you take the time and you complete, go to the Air Safety Institute website, you can get the VFR pilot personal minimums contract is what it is, because you fill it out and then you actually sign it. You have a witness, and then there's one for IFR also. And so I was just teaching a rusty pilot, so I happen to have this handy because I talk about it at pretty much every seminar that I give. And the reason it's important is when we take the time to sit down on the ground and think about what our minimums are, then we're less likely to deviate from that when we're in the air. If we don't, then we tend to fall prey to the, I think I can get away with it this time, or I'm not sure if this is that uncomfortable. I might just try it for a little longer. And you then find yourself in a position where you wish you were on the ground, and you want to be on the ground wishing you were flying, not the other way around, right? And so this is where it's really important. What are your minimums? And my minimums are going to be different from Pat and from Jamie, and I'll share with you one of mine. I will not fly a general aviation airplane over the mountains at night. You can't pay me enough money to do that. That is one of my personal minimums, and I know that. I tell everybody about that, and so there's no question about it. If we're going to be departing, later in the evening, and now it gets darker here at 4:45.
Yeah.
So I'll tell people, listen, we got to leave at like 3:30 or at 4 because I want to be back and I want to fly over the mountains at night. So that's an example of a personal minimum.
Yeah,
that's a great one. And Harry just brings up the part about Part 91, takeoff 00, ceiling on the ground, zero visibility is legal. And Pat, I know you always get a kick out of me saying, but I do believe, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's not galactically stupid. No. You can take off in 00, but you can't come back if something goes wrong. There's a good reason for having personal minimums, writing them down, and I don't even think about what's Pat's minimum, right, Pat? I mean, my minimum is my minimum, and I shouldn't amend that because of what you're doing. I amend it because I'm flying a better, more capable airplane, my skills are up, I'm proficient, or I lower them or raise them, as the case may be, because I haven't flown in 3 months, this airplane is new to me. You agree, Pat?
Yeah. For me, as far as personal minimums go, mostly they have to do with IFR. I won't fly IMC at night. Regardless, I won't fly IMC at night. I won't take off in weather that I know is going to make me shoot an approach to minimums at the other end, because it's going to be a trip and I may be tired and all of a sudden and I may not be up to it for whatever reason. And I won't fly IMC without a functioning autopilot. Just won't do it. Now, I practice flying without an autopilot. Just did it the other day. Flew an actual approach by hand. It wasn't pretty, but I got us down. But I won't. Those three for me are just showstoppers. And interesting, when I'm doing a check ride, one of the questions that I ask, because as you know, the FAA wants us to do scenario-based training now, and so the questioning during the oral is scenario-based. And one of the questions is, how did you determine that the weather was suitable for the flight today? And one of the things that I hope that they're going to bring up during that conversation is my personal minimums. So if I hear that, this is going to be a good ride. If I don't, then I have to start digging about, well, what are some no-go items, and what are some showstoppers, and what about this and what about that? And I'm going to pull the information out of them. It makes me a little bit concerned about their depth of weather knowledge, which, by the way, generally speaking, is sometimes just barely adequate. Yeah.
By the way, we're joined by semi-royalty this evening. We have the Nate Abel Flying Club online from Texas. absolutely amazing flying club. If anybody ever doubted that flying clubs are viable, NATABLE Flying Club is a great place to look. And they have a fantastic question. How do you deal with personal minimums when you're managing a club with 40 plus members? And the NATABLE Flying Club is an absolutely terrific club. And this is a really smart question because each individual pilot should have their own personal minimums. What do you think, Kay? Should the club also establish minimums beyond the FAA's VFR, IFR minimums? Or do you think they leave it up to the individual pilots as long as it's that or better?
Most clubs that I've seen have their own personal minimums, and it's in the flying club, rules and regulations. So a lot of them will require you to do an annual flight review. And they will require more takeoffs and landings within a certain time frame. And those are usually more strict than the FAA requirements. And so there are really three set of standards. The regulatory requirements, okay, that's number one. Number two is the flying club or flight school that you're flying at. And then three is your own personal one. And the question about, well, how do you go about developing that? Is it with the flight instructor? Well, if you're a student pilot, yes, your flight instructor will kind of guide you through as you are doing crosswind landings, for example. There's a section in the personal minimums contracts about landings. And so you probably are not going to put the full crosswind max capability of the airplane on there if you're a student pilot because you don't have that experience. And so you might have 5 knots. And then as you get more experience, and then you can change that because it is a living document. For all of us, it changes every so often, and it changes from one plane to another plane. And Jamie, as you mentioned earlier, depending on how proficient you are.
Yeah, Pat, earlier this year, we had that smoke from the Oregon wildfires that made it out to the East Coast. And I flew from Connecticut down to Maryland, a few hundred miles. And it was 3 to 4 miles visibility most of the way. By the time I got to Maryland, it was up to about 5. That is not relaxing flying. That's fairly stressful. And you'd be surprised at how little visual information you have when it's only 3 miles. So I'm kind of with Kay. Go fly with a flight instructor under challenging conditions and see if that's something that you're comfortable with and amend your personal minimums up or down based on that. Would that work for you?
Yeah, I'll normally ask a question at some point during a check ride or flight review or any number of things that I'm doing. Have you actually ever flown in marginal VFR? Have you ever actually flown with 3 miles visibility and say 1,000 or 1,100 foot ceilings or something like that? And I always smile when somebody says, yes, my flight instructor did that for me, because that flight instructor could very well have saved that person's life. And I'll give you a really sad example. Here in Houston, this past Wednesday, I think it's the 8th, a young fellow took off out of West Houston Airport, 8 o'clock at night, dark, 900 foot ceilings. They found the airplane at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. No survivors. So this weather is serious business, folks. It is serious business. If you don't treat it with respect, bad things happen. Bad things happen.
Yeah. I've owned a couple tail draggers in my life, and I really like them a lot. But I don't fly tail draggers a lot anymore. I just don't have access to one for the moment, although I should shortly. My personal minimum for tail draggers is no more than 10 knots of wind within 30 degrees of runway alignment. I'm confident I can handle that. And if I flew a tail dragger more often, maybe I'd get beyond that. But I don't want to get into a position where that wind is 15 and it's 40 degrees off runway alignment. And now I'm on short file and I don't have the confidence that I can do this. And that doubt is creeping into your head. So personal minimums can relate to any aspect of the weather or the environment. Go ahead and do them. But I have to bring in Stump the Ambassador because it's getting late in the hour and y'all have been great. But I know you want to see us if you can stump us because, this is the opportunity. The question, Pat, I'm going to throw this to you. It's about how do you close an IFR flight plan from a non-towered airport when your destination is a non-towered airport? If you're at a towered airport, it's automatic. It just happens. But if I'm flying into West Houston, and that's not going to happen tonight, don't worry, how do I close my IFR flight plan?
All right. So if you're on an IFR flight plan and you're cleared for the approach, at some point, the controller is going to say something like no traffic observed between you and the airport. Frequency change approved. Don't forget to cancel your flight plan here with me or on the ground with clearance delivery. That's typically what you'll get when you're coming into a non-towered field. Now, let's say that there's not an RCO or a clearance delivery frequency on the field. And let's say that you got low enough that you can't reach the controlling authority to cancel in the air, then you've got to really only have a couple of options. One would be to call on your cell phone. You could call flight service if you wanted to, and they would relay the cancellation. But if you look at the chart supplement, that green book, many non-towered fields now have a telephone number to the local, whatever the controlling authority is, for whether it's center or approach control, where you can pick up a clearance on the ground, especially if you don't have an RCO on the field to do so. So you can actually just pick up the cell phone and call them and cancel. Alternatively, if you don't have that, once again, just get out of the airplane, shut it down, and make your way to a payphone or the FBO phone or something like that and call flight service, or find that number locally. Certainly someone locally would be able to tell you what telephone number you can call and cancel. Oftentimes you can do it in the air if you're not too low.
I love that. Thank you very much. Kay, what do you think? I believe he had an effective answer for that.
He did. Yeah.
And for the first time ever, we have corresponding notes from viewers who were right there with us. Ron Schusterman, RCL or flight service. Harry Feingersh, 4Flight. But we had all kinds of people coming in and telling us what to do. I love this. It makes my job so much easier. Absolutely. Hey, we've done almost an entire hour on this, and I can't thank you enough. From Eric Pittman to Hunter Timko, Harry, Erdem, Mike B, great questions. Thank you so much for being part of this. I need you to remember, we are scheduled at this moment to do another Ask an Ambassador on Tuesday, December 28th, 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. Figure it out in the middle. I'm leaving it up to you. Do we do that one or not? Leave it in the notes, in the comments. Tell us, because we can't make a decision on our own. We're not like that. We have personal minimums, but we don't have a personal scheduler. So let us know if we're doing the 28th or if we're just enjoying a long holiday. This is very important to us, so you must reply. And remember to share the link for this broadcast, because y'all have some great comments up that deserve a wider reach. Kay, what do you have for parting words for tonight's audience? Because I think this is the best audience we've ever had. And really, I'm talking to you, the best audience ever. Kay, what do you have for those folks?
Well, no matter where you are in the world, make sure that you really understand the weather in that region. Don't take it lightly. It's important that you understand not just the theory, but how it affects your flight. And more importantly, how you get accurate weather timely in your cockpit. So make sure that you know your avionics and just take the weather seriously.
Pat, you have something to share? And it can be broad ranging. It can be about the weather. It can be about regulations. It could be about Santa's schedule, because I know you have a connection. What would you like to share tonight?
We're like that. Me and Sant. I call him Sant.
Okay.
Yeah, me and Sant. Well, first of all, take a look at a surface analysis chart and see if you can take a look at that and predict what the weather's going to be, or judge what the weather's going to be based on what you're seeing there. Look at a high pressure system. What kind of weather does a high bring? What kind of pressure? What kind of weather does a low bring? What kind of weather does a cold front bring? A warm front, a trough, a dry line, which is sometimes a little rare, but they happen in the Midwest part of the country. Stationary fronts, occluded fronts. Have a working knowledge. You don't have to understand necessarily how those fronts happen, but understand when you see them on the weather chart, what kind of weather you could reasonably expect to encounter if you were crossing any one of those kind of air masses or frontal boundaries or what have you. Set your personal minimums and live by them, or or you will die by them. So one of the two.
That's a very good point. I'm going to keep it fairly simple. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever type of flying you like to do, visit your local airport, flying club, flight school, FBO, whatever. Go meet somebody and hook up to go flying and learn from them. You might end up bumping into Mike Jesh and benefit from the big brain on that guy. You might bump into Pat or Kay and say, wow, they really know stuff. Who could say? But go and make an active effort to learn something from somebody about how you can be a better, safer, more competent and confident pilot, because you can do it. And best of all, it's kind of fun. Folks, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And huge thanks to our executive producer, Donnie McKay, who's in the background. You didn't get to see him tonight, but he's got a bug in our ear constantly. It's the reason we look smart, because Donnie McKay is running this show. Kay Sunderham in California, thank you so much for getting up in the middle of lunchtime to join us. Pat out in Texas, thank you for putting down the barbecue for long enough to participate in this remarkable event. I am Jamie Beckett in Central Florida. I got to go pick some oranges or something on the way to the house. So thanks a lot. We'll see you next time, maybe on the 28th if you decide, maybe in 2022. It's entirely up to you. So let us know. We'll see you next time, whenever that is.
Bye-bye.
Bye.